600 drones in one night. That's the number Moscow's own mayor posted. Not a Ukrainian claim, not a rumor circulating out of Kyiv, but Sergei Sobyanin himself, on his own Telegram channel in the middle of August 2026. And that wasn't even the only night it happened. A few nights later, it happened again. Over 600 more, same city, same mayor, posting the same kind of update like it had already become routine. Something has shifted in this war, and it isn't the front line. It's the sky over the Russian capital. For most of the last 4.5 years, the story about Moscow has been simple. Whatever happens to Kyiv, Moscow stays untouched. Russia burns Ukrainian cities and Moscow keeps its lights on, its restaurants open, its metro running on schedule, insulated from the war it started. That assumption is the reason Russian state television could show this war as something happening far away, to someone else, on someone else's screen. That assumption is the thing being tested right now. Not broken, tested. And the difference between those two words is going to matter for the next 20 minutes, because this channel doesn't do the version of this story where one dramatic night means the war is suddenly over. It isn't. What's actually happening is slower, stranger, and in some ways more interesting than a single knockout blow. So stick with me, because by the end, you'll understand exactly what's confirmed, what Russia itself admits, and where this genuinely leaves Vladimir Putin, which is not where most headlines are telling you. If you're new here, this is the channel that treats you like you can handle the complicated version. No shouting, no guessing dressed up as certainty, just what's actually known, sourced, and what it means. If that's useful to you, hit subscribe now, because we're going to keep tracking this one as it develops. Let's start with the plain sentence version of what happened, because it's worth saying once cleanly before we go anywhere else. Beginning in early August 2026, Ukraine escalated its long-range drone campaign against targets deep inside Russia, including repeated mass attacks on the Moscow region itself, striking warehouses, fuel infrastructure, and military-linked facilities, while Russia continued its own bombardment of Ukrainian cities. That's the confirmed core. Everything else is detail, context, and the harder question of what it actually adds up to. This is happening more than 4.5 years into the full-scale war Russia launched in February of 2022, well past the point where either side expected a quick resolution, deep into a phase defined less by dramatic territorial swings and more by long-range strikes, attrition, and stalled diplomacy. Here's the first piece of the pattern, and it's the one most coverage skips because it isn't as visual as a warehouse fire. This didn't start in August. Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian oil refineries have been running for well over a year, working through a long list of targets, from Ryazan and Volgograd in the south, to Krasnodar and Syzran, to the massive Gazprom neft complex in Omsk, more than 1,500 miles from the Ukrainian border, described by Ukraine's own general staff as the last of the 11 largest gasoline producers in the country to be hit. That's a domino most people never saw fall, because a strike on a refinery most people have never heard of doesn't trend the way 600 drones over Moscow in one night does. But it's the domino that explains everything that came after it. What looked in June and July like scattered nights, a refinery near Moscow itself hit at Kapotnya, just 10 miles from the Kremlin. The Slavneft Yanos plant north of the capital, struck for a second night running in early August, wasn't scattered at all. It was a curve climbing month over month, and mid-August is simply where that curve became impossible to describe as background noise anymore. Picture it like water finding a crack in a wall. The first drops don't do anything visible. Nobody worries about a crack that's just damp. But water doesn't stop being water because nobody's watching. And by the time the crack is wide enough to see from across the room, the pressure behind it has been building the entire time. That's the shape of this campaign. The scattered refinery strikes through spring and early summer were the damp patch. Mid-August is the crack you can now see from across the room. And the target list here isn't random. There's a reason air forces have gone after fuel refineries specifically in past wars. And it's not because they burn well on camera, though they do. It's because a modern military runs on refined fuel more than almost anything else. Tanks need it, transport trucks need it, aircraft need it, and unlike ammunition, you can't stockpile your way around a refinery going offline for weeks at a time. That's the same logic behind the Allied bombing campaign against German oil refineries in 1944, one of the few strategic bombing efforts that measurably shortened a war, not by flattening cities, but by starving an army of the one input it couldn't substitute. Ukraine hitting Bashnef's refinery in Salavat or Slavneft Yanos in Yaroslavl isn't a symbolic gesture aimed at Russian pride. It's the same choke point logic, 80 years later, run with drones instead of bombers. So the drone count kept climbing through July and into August, but the number alone was never the interesting part. What's interesting is what Ukraine started aiming at, because that tells you the strategy. In the first half of August, Ukrainian drones hit Bashnef's refinery in Bashkortostan, more than 1,000 kilometers from the front line, alongside a fire at a nearby wild berries distribution facility in the same industrial zone. Days later, the Slavneft Yanos refinery north of Moscow was struck for the second night in a row, forcing traffic restrictions on roads into the capital. Then came the 16th of August, the night that made international headlines properly for the first time. Russia's own defense ministry said it destroyed 822 drones nationwide overnight, calling it one of the largest Ukrainian aerial assaults of the entire war. Moscow's mayor said at least 600 of those had been aimed specifically at the capital, with just over a third intercepted over the region itself. Not all of them were stopped. Russian authorities reported at least 6 people killed nationwide, and a fire tore through a wild berries logistics warehouse in the town of Kolodino, just outside Podolsk, a facility so large that firefighting helicopters were still dropping water on it well into the next day. Wild Berries is Russia's biggest online retailer, the kind of everyday logistics backbone ordinary households depend on for everything from clothing to electronics. And Ukrainian officials have argued that platforms like it also move dual-use goods supporting the military supply chain, which is precisely why its warehouses keep coming up on the target list again and again. By the 18th and 19th of August, it happened again. Moscow's mayor reported more than 600 drones heading toward the capital region overnight, with around 180 destroyed over Moscow Oblast, in what Russian state media described as the largest such assault on the region in 2 years. This time, officials reported no deaths, but at least 3 people were injured, including a 10-year-old girl, and another wild berries facility near the capital took damage from falling debris. Flights were disrupted at several of Moscow's major airports as the barrage came in. 2 major nights, 6 days apart, both large enough that the mayor of the Russian capital felt compelled to post live updates to his own residents as the drones approached. In a country where the war had spent 4.5 years being something that happened to somebody else. And behind both of those nights sits a detail worth sitting with for a second. A large share of the drones doing this work, by some estimates more than half of everything Ukraine currently flies at long range, comes from a single domestic manufacturer called Firepoint, run by a woman in her mid-30s named Irina Terek, who trained as an architect and ran a small furniture and architectural concrete business before the war. She was brought in as a production manager in 2023 to help turn a scrappy startup's prototypes into something that could actually be mass-produced, and within a few years, found herself running one of Ukraine's largest defense companies, with workforce numbers reported to have climbed from under 4,000 employees in spring 2026 to more than 7,000 by August, spread across dozens of production sites. That's not a footnote. It's a meaningful part of the actual explanation for how a country with a fraction of Russia's air power keeps putting 600 drones over its enemy's capital in a single night, twice in the same week. And this isn't staying neatly contained inside 2 countries either. Stray drones drifting across borders during these barrages have periodically triggered alerts in neighboring NATO airspace over the past 2 years. And officials across the alliance have said openly they remain nervous about the margin for error shrinking every time a barrage this size runs in either direction. Nobody is calling that a NATO-Russia incident, but it's exactly the kind of near miss European governments have been quietly worried about, and part of why this campaign gets watched so closely, well outside the 2 countries actually fighting it. Now let's be precise about what's confirmed here versus what's assessment. Confirmed, sourced to Russian officials themselves. The drone counts Moscow's mayor and defense ministry published, the wild berries warehouse fires, the refinery strikes Ukraine's own military has publicly claimed, the casualty figures reported after the 16th. Assessment, not confirmed fact. How much lasting damage these refinery strikes have actually done to Russia's overall fuel output, since neither government has released independently verified production figures, and both sides have obvious incentives to exaggerate in opposite directions. One step further into inference, that the pattern of targeting logistics and fuel infrastructure specifically reflects a deliberate Ukrainian strategy shift towards sustained economic pressure. That's a reasonable read of the target list, but still a read, not a confirmed doctrine document. And squarely speculative. Any claim that this campaign alone is forcing a Russian retreat from the war. Nobody credible is saying that, and we're not going to say it either. There's a human layer to this that's easy to skip past when you're just reading drone counts off a mayor's social media feed. People who spent 4.5 years assuming this war would stay somewhere else are now checking air raid alerts before a night shift at a warehouse. Families near Koledino watched a distribution center some of them may have worked in burn for the better part of a day. A 10-year-old girl was injured in her own region because a piece of intercepted hardware came down somewhere it shouldn't have. That reassurance that used to sit underneath daily life in the Russian capital is cracked now, at least at the edges. Not because Moscow is under siege, it isn't, but because the psychological floor that let millions of Russians treat this as someone else's war has a visible fracture in it that wasn't there back in the spring. If you're finding this useful, the kind of story where we slow down and actually separate what's known from what's guessed, that's genuinely the whole reason this channel exists. That's the audience we're building here, and I'm glad you're part of it. So here's the fair countercase, because a story this one-sided would be lying to you by omission. Russia's own numbers, even at face value, show the overwhelming majority of these drones are being intercepted, roughly 800 out of somewhere around 820 on the worst reported night, a success rate most air defense systems would envy. Russian officials describe the resulting damage as manageable, isolated incidents rather than a capital under any kind of genuine siege. And this war runs hard in both directions. In the same window, Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukrainian cities pushed the monthly civilian death toll to some of the highest levels since the earliest months of the war. And Ukrainian officials have repeatedly pointed to a shortage of air defense interceptors, including the Patriot systems that do much of the heavy lifting against Russian drones. If the argument is that Ukraine is winning the drone war outright, the honest answer is not decisively, not yet, and Ukrainian civilians are paying at least as high a price, arguably higher. None of this has translated into political comfort on the Ukrainian side either. Zelensky has faced real pressure at home through this same stretch, including reshuffles inside his defense apparatus, even as the country absorbs some of its worst civilian casualty numbers in years. Both governments are managing real strain. Putin's economic and diplomatic, Zelensky's political and deeply human. Neither one is a knockout blow. So why does any of this matter if Russia is intercepting the overwhelming majority of these drones and still out-killing Ukraine on its own side of the border? Because interception rate was never really the metric that mattered most here. Air defense is a finite resource. Batteries, trained crews, radar coverage, interceptor stockpiles, and every night Russia spends shooting down 600 drones over Moscow is a night that hardware and attention isn't somewhere else, guarding a refinery further east or a supply depot closer to the actual front. Every refinery that catches fire, even briefly, is fuel capacity that has to be rerouted or slowly rebuilt. Every warehouse belonging to a retailer as large as Wildberries that burns is a supply chain disruption that eventually shows up on ordinary Russian shelves. None of that wins a war by itself, but it's the kind of cumulative pressure that tends to show up months later, in places nobody's really watching in the moment, in refining output figures, in insurance costs, in how much of an already stretched defense budget gets quietly redirected toward protecting the capital instead of pushing supplies to the front line. That's the actual mechanism at work here, not one dramatic night. It's a slow tax paid every few days on a system that has to defend an enormous amount of territory with a genuinely finite amount of everything. Layer that on top of a Russian defense budget already sitting near record highs, while separate pressure builds on energy export revenue from sanctions and a battered refining sector, and you get an economy absorbing strain from more than one direction at once, even if no single strike looks decisive sitting on its own. Which brings us to the part of this story most other coverage gets wrong, and the part I deliberately saved for last, because it's the one most likely to be flat-out mangled elsewhere. Is Putin actually being pushed toward some kind of withdrawal? No, not in any confirmed sense, and I want to be blunt about correcting that because it's a genuinely common misread right now. Nobody in the Kremlin has used that word. What's actually on the table is closer to the opposite. Russian officials have continued to demand Ukrainian withdrawal from contested territory in the east as a precondition for any lasting deal, and as of the most recently confirmed public statements, that basic position hasn't reversed. Here's the part that's real, though, and more interesting than a fake retreat headline. There is a peace framework under active negotiation for months, built out of talks tracing back to a Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage, Alaska, in August of 2025. That summit produced no signed ceasefire and no formal agreement, but it did produce a phrase, the so-called spirit of Anchorage, used almost exclusively by Russian officials to describe a supposed set of shared understandings Moscow claimed should guide everything that followed. By the summer of 2026, Even Russia's own diplomats had begun quietly acknowledging that momentum had faded. Separately from that slogan, negotiating progress on a broader security and territorial framework did advance considerably, with Zelensky himself telling reporters that something in the range of 90% of the core provisions, particularly the security guarantee language Ukraine considers essential, had been worked out in draft form. That 90% figure is real and has been repeated by Ukrainian and American officials more than once. What hasn't moved is the remaining sliver, chiefly the question of territory, where Russia's demands and Ukraine's red lines remain essentially irreconcilable. Analysts tracking the talks have described Putin as stalling deliberately, avoiding an outright rejection that might invite fresh sanctions, while declining the concessions that would actually close the deal. One widely cited assessment put it plainly: Putin has no obvious path to outright battlefield victory this year, but also cannot accept a genuine compromise that leaves Ukraine standing as a sovereign, functioning state, because that outcome would be very hard to sell at home as anything other than a loss. So here's the honest version of the connection between the drone campaign and the diplomacy, and it's a connection, not a clean cause and effect. The strikes on Moscow don't force Putin to the table. Nothing has forced Putin to the table in 4.5 years of war. What they do is raise the cost of not going to the table, refinery by refinery, warehouse by warehouse, night by night, while Russia's economy, already strained by near-record defense spending, absorbs damage it can no longer fully hide from its own capital's residents. Moscow's mayor posting live drone counts on social media is itself a kind of quiet admission. The war Russian television spent years describing as something happening elsewhere is now something the mayor of the capital has to explain to his own constituents multiple times in a single week. What happens next depends on things this campaign alone can't control. Watch whether the refinery strikes start showing up clearly in fuel prices and export figures over the coming months, because that's the number that would tell you whether the economic pressure is real or mostly symbolic. Watch whether Russia starts pulling additional air defense assets back toward Moscow in a way that visibly thins coverage elsewhere, because that's the kind of shift analysts would read as this campaign actually working strategically rather than just generating headlines. Watch the calendar too. This war has an established pattern of both sides intensifying strikes on energy infrastructure as winter approaches. And if these August strikes turn out to be the opening moves of that seasonal campaign, rather than a one-off summer spike, the pressure on Russian fuel supply could compound rather than fade. And watch the language coming out of the Kremlin around that stalled remaining slice of the peace framework. Not for any announcement of withdrawal, because that isn't coming, but for any sign the internal calculation around how long Moscow can afford to keep stalling is starting to shift. One more thing worth sitting with before we close. This is a war being fought right now disproportionately through very ordinary infrastructure. A retail warehouse, a fuel refinery, a distribution center outside a city most residents assumed was permanently untouchable, not tank columns or dramatic breakthroughs